A long time ago, in a small village called Zuka, there was a belief that filled people's hearts with fear, a superstition so strong that no one dared to question it. The villagers believed that twins were a curse, a sign of bad luck that could bring disaster to the entire community. For many generations, the king and village elders enforced a strict law. If a woman gives birth to twins, she and her family must be banished. Their names will be erased, and no one will ever speak of them again. No one knew how or why this law had started, but it had become a part of the village's traditions. Everyone accepted it, even if their hearts secretly questioned its cruelty. In the same village lived a poor but hard-working farmer named Jabari and his loving wife, Ifunanya. They had been married for 15 years, yet their home remained empty and quiet. They had no children. Every night they knelt together and prayed, "Please, Lord, bless us with a child." They had waited so long. They had watched other families play with their little ones, but their own arms remained empty. Still, they never gave up hope. Jabari would hold his wife's hands tightly and whisper, "One day we will have a child. We just have to keep believing." Ifunanya would smile sadly, nodding, but deep inside she wondered, what if we never do? But in Zuka Village, the joy of pregnancy came with fear. Every woman, when she discovered she was expecting, would secretly panic. Would it be one baby or two? Mothers-to-be and their husbands would pray desperately, "Please let it be just one, not two." Even Jabari and Ifunanya, who had waited for a baby for so many years, whispered the same words. Because no matter how much they wanted a child, they knew the risk. As the years passed, the whispers in the village grew louder. Some mocked Ifunanya, calling her barren. Some blamed Jabari, saying he must be cursed. Maybe he is not a real man. Some women sneered when they passed Ifunanya. Others whispered to Jabari, telling him, "You should take another wife. Ifunanya will never give you a child." But Jabari stood firm. "No, I love my wife, and I will. Wait, our time will come." Then one day, everything changed. After years of waiting, Ifunanya fell pregnant. The joy in their hearts was unimaginable. Their home, once so quiet and empty, was now filled with laughter and excitement. Even the villagers who had once mocked them congratulated them. "Your prayers have been answered," they said. But fate had one more twist in store for them. 9 months later, in the middle of the night, Ifunanya went into labor. With the help of an elderly midwife, she struggled and screamed, fighting through the pain. And then a baby's cry filled the air. Jabari, waiting outside, fell to his knees in joy. But just as the midwife was about to wrap the baby in a cloth, she froze. Her hands shook. Another baby was coming. Moments later, another cry pierced the silence. Not one child, but two. Jabari rushed inside, his face glowing with excitement. But when he saw Ifunanya, his heart stopped. She was not smiling, she was crying. Tears streamed down her face, not from happiness, but from fear. "Jabari," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jabari stared at their two sons, so small, so perfect. "We have been blessed with twins," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. But Ifunanya shook her head. "No, my love, we have been cursed." Within moments, the entire village knew. Twins have been born. The terrible news spread like wildfire. The king's guards rushed to the palace. Torches were lit. Voices shouted in fear. The king, sitting on his throne, heard the whispers, and his face turned to stone. "Bring them to me." Jabari and Ifunanya knew there was no escape. With heavy hearts, they wrapped their newborns in soft cloths and walked toward the king's palace. The people parted as they passed. Some stared, in pity, others in fear. Before the king, they stood silently, waiting for their fate. The king's face was unreadable as he spoke. "You know the law," he said coldly. "The twins must be taken to the evil forest." Gasps filled the room. Ifunanya fell to her knees, clutching her babies tightly. "Please, Your Majesty," she begged, her voice trembling. "We have waited so long for these children. Have mercy." Jabari's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists of anger and pain. "We will not let our children die," he shouted. But the king's face remained unmoved. The law is the law. And then Jabari did the unthinkable. He took a deep breath, his eyes burning with defiance, and declared, "Then we will go too." Ifunanya's fingers tightened around his hand. "We would rather die than abandon our children," she whispered, and with those words their fate was sealed. For generations the law had been absolute. No king had ever dared to question it. Finally, his voice cut through the silence. So be it. The verdict was final. Jabari, Ifunanya, and their newborn twins were to be exiled, sent into the evil forest, a place where no one had ever returned from alive. As the guards led them toward the edge of the village, no one spoke. Even the villagers, who once whispered cruel words, now stood in stunned silence. Some looked guilty, others afraid, but no one dared to challenge the king's decree. Jabari's grip tightened around Ifunanya's hand as they crossed the village gates. The dark forest loomed ahead, its towering trees casting long shadows over. The land, would they survive, or was this truly their end? Ifunanya held her babies close, whispering a quiet prayer. Jabari's jaw tightened. No matter what lay ahead, he would protect his family. With trembling hands but unbreakable hearts, Jabari and Ifunanya stepped into the unknown, their newborn twins cradled in their arms. The villagers watched in silence, knowing they would never see them again. Or would they? The forest swallowed them whole. The trees, ancient and twisted, stretched toward the sky like clawed fingers. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged. An old woman, hunched and frail, stepped into their path. Her face was weathered. With time, her hollow eyes filled with hunger. "Please," she croaked, "I have not eaten in days." Ifunanya instinctively clutched her babies closer. Jabari hesitated, glancing at the small bundle of food. They had barely enough to last them. A day. If they gave it away, what would they eat? But one look at the old woman's trembling hands, and Ifunanya knew the answer. They knelt down and offered her their last meal. The old woman's eyes widened, shimmering with gratitude. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, her frail body visibly regaining strength. Then something unexpected happened. The hunch in her back straightened. Her hands stopped shaking. The tired lines on her face softened. She was no longer frail or weak. She stood tall, her eyes burning with an ancient wisdom. "Because of your kindness," she whispered, her voice steady and powerful, "I will give you something in return." She reached into her tattered robes and pulled out a small bundle of strange herbs. "Take this." Jabari and Ifunanya stared in wonder as she placed the bundle in their hands. "These herbs hold great power," she explained. "If placed upon the eyes of a blind king, they will restore his sight." Before they could speak, the woman vanished into thin air, disappearing as mysteriously as she had come. Only the lingering scent of earth and magic remained. Jabari tightened his grip on the herbs, a new fire burning in his chest. Their journey wasn't over. They had a new purpose. With renewed determination, Jabari and Ifunanya pressed on. The forest seemed less terrifying now. Each step forward felt lighter, as if the old woman's blessing was guiding them. But they kept moving. They had to survive. They had to reach the king. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the trees finally thinned out. Ahead, a village came into view. Jabari and Ifunanya's arrival did not go unnoticed. A man and woman covered in dust, holding newborn twins. It was a sight that no villager had ever seen before. A group of people gathered, whispering among themselves. A man stepped forward, his face full of disbelief. "You came from the evil forest?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jabari nodded. "We have something for your king," Ifunanya added. "Something that can change his fate." The villagers, sensing something important was about to happen, rushed them to the palace. Seated on a golden throne, the king of the land waited. He was a ruler without sight, a man born blind, who had long given up hope of ever seeing the world. When Jabari and Ifunanya were brought before him, he did not look impressed. "No one can heal what fate has taken," he muttered. But something about their presence, their determination, made him curious enough to give them a chance. Jabari knelt before the king, crushing the herbs into a paste. With steady hands, he gently applied it to the king's closed eyes. The room fell silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the king inhaled sharply. His fingers twitched. A flicker of light appeared in his vision. He blinked, and then his world changed. For the first time in his life, he could see. A roar of astonishment filled the palace. Servants gasped. Guards whispered in shock. The king himself staggered to his feet, blinking in wonder. I can see." Tears of disbelief streamed down his face as he looked around, truly seeing for the first time. The palace erupted into celebration. The man who had lived in darkness had been given the gift of sight, and Jabari and Ifunanya, once outcasts, now stood at the center of a miracle. The king could hardly believe it. For years, he had accepted his blindness as fate, never imagining he would one day see the world with his own eyes. Overcome with gratitude, he summoned his elders and advisors, declaring that a grand feast be held in honor of Jabari and Ifunanya. "No guest shall leave hungry," he commanded, his voice ringing through the palace. That night, the palace was filled with music, laughter, and endless food. Servants carried in golden platters of roasted meats, fresh fruits, and sweet honey cakes, and the air was thick with the scent of spices and celebration. Jabari and Ifunanya sat at the king's side, their twins nestled safely in their arms. Just days ago, they had been outcasts, condemned to die, and now they were guests of honor in the most powerful kingdom they had ever seen. As the night wore on, the king stood from his throne and raised a golden goblet. "Tell me," he said, turning to Jabari and Ifunanya, "why did you risk everything to help a stranger?" Silence fell over the hall as Jabari rose to speak. "We did not come here for reward," he began, his voice strong. "We came because we know what it means to suffer unjustly." And so they told their story. They spoke of Zuka Village, of the cruel law that condemned twins to death. They spoke of their banishment, of the evil forest, and of the old woman who had given them the miracle herbs. The king's expression darkened. "Such a tradition still exists?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. Jabari and Ifunanya nodded solemnly. For a long moment the king was silent, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the torches lining the hall. Then he did something no one expected. He rose from his throne, lifted his royal staff, and struck it against the marble floor. "From this day forward," he declared, his voice echoing through the palace, "Jabari and his family shall be granted land of their own." The hall erupted in gasps. The king's next words sent shockwaves through the crowd. "Half of my kingdom shall belong to them." A stunned silence followed. Jabari and Ifunanya fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. "Your Majesty, this is too much," Ifunanya whispered. But the king smiled. "Once you were cast into the darkness. Now you shall rule beside me, bringing light to others." And so Jabari became a king. The man who had once been a simple farmer, mocked, ridiculed, and sentenced to die, now sat on a throne beside one of the greatest rulers of the land. Many years passed. Back in Zuka Village, the same king who had once banished Jabari and Ifunanya had grown old and frail. His once proud voice had weakened. His once sharp vision was gone. His eyes clouded with blindness. Doctors, healers, and spiritual men tried everything, but nothing worked. One day, a traveling palm wine tapper came to the king's palace and said, "I have heard of a great ruler, a man who once restored the sight of a blind king. Perhaps he can help you." With one last shred of hope, the old king set out on a journey, never realizing he was traveling toward the very man he had once condemned. At the gates of a mighty palace, the old king was greeted by guards. "Who seeks an audience with our ruler?" one of them asked. I am but an old man in need of healing," the former king replied. And so he was led inside. Jabari, now a powerful king himself, stood at the top of his grand stone steps, his twin sons, now strong young men, standing beside him. He looked down at the man who had once exiled him, the man who had sentenced his children to die. The old king's voice trembled as he spoke. "Please, mighty one, I have lost my sight. I beg for your help." Jabari said nothing at first. He simply studied the old man, remembering the pain of exile, the cold of the evil forest, the fear of losing his children. Then, at last, he spoke. "Why have you come to my kingdom?" The old king froze. Recognition dawned in his faded eyes. His breath hitched. It cannot be." Jabari did not respond. Instead, he took the same mystical herbs given to him long ago and crushed them into a paste. He gently applied them to the old king's tired eyes. A hush fell over the room. And then, for the second time in his life, the herbs worked. The old king gasped, blinking as light flooded into his vision. For the first time, he truly saw, not just with his eyes, but with his heart. His lips quivered as he bowed his head in shame. "Forgive me," he whispered. Jabari did not hesitate. He placed a gentle hand on the old king's shoulder. "The past cannot be changed," he said, "but the future can." And so, together, they traveled back to Zuka Village, where a new fate awaited them all. In Zuka Village, the elders gathered. The priests were summoned. For centuries, the village had followed a cruel law, one that doomed innocent children simply because they were born as twins. But that day, the law was abolished forever. The priests performed rituals to appease the gods, and the gods, for the first time in history, accepted the change. From that moment on, twins were no longer seen as curses, but as blessings. Mothers wept with relief. Fathers rejoiced. For the first time, when a woman gave birth to twins, there was no fear, no sorrow, only celebration. As the village erupted in joy, Jabari and Ifunanya stood side by side, their sons towering beside them. The family that was once cast into darkness now shined like a beacon of hope. And so, the story of the banished twins became a legend, one that forever changed the destiny of their people. Did you love this tale? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Roots of African Tales for more powerful stories from the heart of Africa.